Well, he has become one of the most dominant faces, the most recognizable faces internationally in tennis commentary. It is Nick Lester, found on Twitter at Nick Lester. And I can't imagine how much work his passport has got with all the international travel you do and all the tournaments. I got to meet Nick a couple years ago at the US Open and then saw him as well at Indian Wells in 2019. I'm Bryan Fenley. I am a broadcaster at the ATP Challenger level in America. So it is a blast to have on Nick, someone who I admire, somebody who I look up to. And we're going to look at his career. I know he's been on a couple different podcasts talking about his career, but I have some fun questions that perhaps he's going to answer very well, but maybe hasn't been asked yet. So we'll get a look into some key insights and observations from him and what makes his journey inspirational. And one of the things, Nick, that I recall in one of the most recent podcasts that you did, and you talked about this, where you said, no matter what, you're always an optimist. And that applies to your career. That applies to tennis coming back with the challenges that it's had in the last couple of years with COVID and all that stuff. But where did you find, maybe at the beginning of your career, where that optimism was tested the most as you were trying to break out in the business and make a name for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, honestly, Brian, I had no real aspirations when I was younger to be a broadcaster. My tennis route was wanting to play the game. I always loved the game, so I wanted to try and sort of play professionally, which I was able to do for 18 months, 2 years to a limited degree. And once that finished, once I decided that I wasn't probably going to be good enough, I actually, probably as you know, got my coaching qualifications, took a little bit of coaching up because I obviously still had a huge passion for tennis as general, and did some work kind of very locally at a small radio station here in the UK for a Saturday, simply just working on a Saturday afternoon. Honestly, I had even back then, sort of going back 14, almost 15 years now, I had no real, there was no path for me to kind of look to sort of say, okay, well, this is the start, this is where I want it to end. It was all just kind of a day-to-day sort of journey. So tennis broadcasting certainly didn't fall my way, but it was something that as time went on, I became obviously more involved in tennis. I was able to kind of climb the ladder, if you like, of broadcasting. I was fortunate that, you know, I got a couple of breaks here and there, and I was fortunate that the world feed, which was a huge profile for us as commentators, grew substantially, you know, over the last 10 years because of the quality of the tennis. So my voice was heard a lot more through the world feed. And that kind of provided a platform going forward. So I think purely from a tennis point of view, from a tennis broadcasting point of view, the journey was always kind of one of just day by day. It wasn't really looking too far ahead. It was just trying to enjoy what I do, because that's ultimately, as I always say to people, my job is my hobby to an extent, and I genuinely mean that. You know, I love watching tennis, so to be able to watch it and talk about it at the same time is for me just a pleasure.
One of the things that you mentioned was that when you were getting your start, you had a journalist, not to be named, who told you that it was really a challenge to break in. He said you either have to be like, and I remember listening to you say this, it was, you got to either be a really good player or a really good journalist. And I guess, you know, perhaps you can't tell the future because you got the last laugh here. But a lot of people, Nick, when they hear that, it can be disheartening, it can be deflating, and they can almost take on those assessments as, okay, I guess I shouldn't do this. Why didn't you listen to him? And what did you believe in yourself at that point where you said, you know what, thanks for that, but I'm going places?
Yeah, I mean, I think I always had you know, obviously financially things have to come into play. We all have to earn a living. So because I was coaching at the time, I always had a slight cushion to fall back on in terms of I always had an income. So there was kind of no need for really me to push the panic button. But then of course it became a challenge of How do I manage the broadcasting side of things with becoming a freelance tennis commentator, but also at the same time earning enough money to keep myself going? So that was always the challenge. I think to answer your question directly, I didn't really take it personally at the time. Maybe again, because aspirationally, back then, 12, 13 years ago, I didn't really see an end game for me. I wasn't really thinking, you know what, in 15 years time, I want to become the world feed voice, or I want to go on Tennis Channel, or I want to go on Sky Sports. That wasn't in my mind. My mind was it was so kind of one step at a time, in terms of, okay, that was at Wimbledon. I was working for Radio Wimbledon at the time. That was the first tennis gig I ever had. So I was a small fish. I always say I was a very small fish at the time, and it was just a case of trying to just learn as I went along, and not sort of get too far ahead in my mind of where I wanted to be. And I think that's the thing with certainly freelancing in our industry, in this industry, is there's so many day-to-day challenges. Things can change very quickly. Producers can come in, new producers can come in, they can want somebody else. All your work that you've done over the years can be undone. So things can change quickly. So one of my philosophies certainly is that I try to just take it one day at a time with my job and my career. Yes, of course, I want to be doing, I'm very happy to be where I'm at, and I'm ecstatic to be doing what I'm doing, and I want it to continue, but I don't try to look too far ahead day to day.
Nick Lester is with us. He is seen on Prime Video, ATP Media, Eurosport. The list goes on. Tennis Australia, ESPN. We could continue on. He is all over the place. I'm Bryan Fenley, a broadcaster for the ATP on the challenger level in the United States. And one of the things that I find fascinating, Nick, is how different audiences in different parts of the world, what they want to see out of a broadcaster. Like, and you look, you know this better than anybody, where the American audience appreciates this, the British audience appreciates something like this, or maybe Europe wants your broadcaster to act like this, and maybe their preference in the United States a little bit different. What have you noticed about different parts of the world in which you've traveled, and what said audiences want out of you? And do you curtail how you broadcast depending upon who you think is going to be watching, or depending upon the region you're in?
Listen, I've probably sat next to, I would say, close to 100 different commentators, analysts, play-by-play guys over my years. And each 100 of those people, men and women, both have a different style. They all have a different style. They all have a different variety. My philosophy, and I believe this is worldwide, I believe actually, to be honest, it's probably coming to the States a bit more, is less is more. My philosophy has always been, don't get in the way of the tennis. Now, tennis is unique in that regard, I think, because obviously from the States, you have NFL, you have basketball, you have all sorts of different sports. We can sit here and watch all different sports, and we can listen to a play-by-play guys, and we can listen to commentators, announcers do it very differently. But I believe with tennis, that the tennis audience, the niche tennis audience, largely operate like a less is more variety. And when I say less is more, what I mean by that is, as I say, for me, the tennis is the show. That's the first and foremost. Never forget that the tennis is the show. That's what people are watching. People don't tune in because Nick Lester's commentating. I don't think. Maybe I'm doing myself an injustice, but that's my philosophy. People have turned on for the tennis. So what am I there to do? I'm there to add something to the coverage. I'm there to bring a feel for conditions, players, tell stories. Am I there to provide a bit of analysis? Yes, talk about what's going on between the lines. If I can't add to the coverage, for me, that's when I'm laying out. So it's a very fine balance, Bryan, in terms of my job. In the UK, unquestionably, that has been the philosophy. That's what I grew up with over here, listening to tennis commentators, generally not getting in the way of the tennis. There are people who operate with a little more voice in terms of what they like to bring to the table. I was just with the USTA for 2 weeks working on the world feed of the US Open. And interestingly, often I heard in my ear from our world feed producer, less is more, less is more. And that's something that you probably wouldn't have heard in the States maybe 10 years ago. But I think that's why I say I think certainly America, I feel, is generally coming around to that way of broadcasting in terms of, let's not get in the way of the tennis. Let's bring something to the table in terms of what you can offer. Of course, you have a job, but let's add to the coverage. That's the crucial thing, Bryan. My job is to add to the coverage. If I don't feel I can do that with any words, then I lay out, because visually, tennis is there to see. There's not a whole lot going on in terms of, it's not like NFL where you've got 25 people on the field or 40 players on the field. There's 2 players, there's a net and a ball. So in terms of what is actually going on visually, there's not a whole lot. But obviously, when you dig a little deeper and get under the bonnet in terms of what is going on, that's then, I feel, my job to be able to tell the story of what is going on matchup wise, stroke wise, story wise, coach wise, what are players doing coaching wise, where have they been, these players, the last couple of weeks, who have they beaten, how are they feeling? And a lot of that, Bryan, comes down to contacts. And that's something that I've tried to build up as well over the years in terms of, for example, Taylor Fritz, Mike Russell, who I've got to know very well over the years. Mike's become a friend of mine. We speak when Taylor's playing, if I'm in the UK. So I've got some background as to what Taylor's been doing, because I can't, if I'm sitting in a studio in London, I can only tell you what Taylor's been doing results-wise from what I can see on the internet and maybe having watched his matches. But that only tells really a quarter of the story. If I can speak to his coach, I can get some good information. I can relay some stories, what he's been practicing on, what he's been working on, how he's feeling at the moment. Obviously, there's discretion, and there's an element of respecting what information they want passed on. But again, you build up trust, and that's where coaches and contacts have become very, very important, even more so in the last 18 months, because with COVID and having not really traveled a whole lot, the information, the sources of information that I have become that much fewer. So therefore, I'm relying on making some calls, trying to dig a little deeper, listening to podcasts, for example. You'd be surprised how many podcasts I listen to these days in terms of interviews. We know how big they are and how much they've grown. So there's a lot of bits of information out there. It's just finding what's there on offer. And then for me personally, having my own style. Everyone's style is different. Again, I'm not saying this is the way to do it, but my style has always been to try and add to the coverage. My words need to have value.
Yeah, so well said. And I think that you're one of the best, if not the best, in the storytelling element, because I was going to ask you what you thought your best strength was, but I think you talked about it right there as far as the storytelling element, which, like you said, there's only so much you can find online, but it's the relationships, those conversations where you get stuff, little nuggets that you could put in at key moments that can beautify the broadcast. We're joined by Nick Lester. I'm Bryan Fenley. And one of the other things that I wanted to ask you was, you also do so much work as an interviewer. So on top of your in-match commentary, you're interviewing. And look, you've been in how many press conferences? Some of the questions that are asked are like, okay, the person probably didn't think more than a second into what they were trying to say. What makes you a great interviewer? And what are the rules in which you like to operate so that you get the best piece of responses from these athletes that you can get based upon how you structure your questions?
Yeah, I think every broadcaster, again, Bryan, will probably, it really entirely depends on what is being asked of you. So obviously with a post-match interview, you might only get 3 or 4 questions on court. I did a lot of that for Davis Cup over the years, did a little bit of that for Amazon as well. And for me, again, my mindset in that is, how can I extract the best possible information from the player in terms of leading them? So at times, maybe not trying to sound too smart, but, you know, a nice, generally, I was always went by the philosophy of first question being, what are your thoughts? Great win. What are your thoughts on the victory? Let's get them talking to me, not necessarily coming in with a statement, because that's the player has just played the match. I've watched the match, but the player's been in it, so I can't tell the player how he feels because I've only sort of come look at it from the outside. So I like to lead the player. I like to lead the player with, what are your thoughts on the win? Then we get a conversation going. Off the back of that, then maybe to sort of dip into picking up on what was said by he or she in terms of, did I hear something that maybe I could build upon? But that question is very open-ended because it really depends on the scenario. So I think post-match interviews, I like personally to hear a kind of deep dive on what the player felt they did well, in terms of, was there anything tactically they used today? Players, I think, in tennis generally are pretty wary of giving too much away, being the fact it's a one-on-one sport. I think, you listen to golfers speak. Golfers talk very openly about their swing and everything else because they're not impacted by anyone else. Tennis players are impacted by someone else. If you play somebody and they're playing lights out, doesn't matter how well you're playing, you're probably not going to win. So, you know what I'm saying? Players, I feel, are generally, I think Andy Murray's probably actually the best at this now. Very open. Andy's very open in press conferences now about his tennis, about how he feels, about opposition players, strengths and weaknesses. And I love to hear that because, obviously for us, we're only seeing it from the outside. But I certainly feel that extracting information from professional tennis players tactically and in terms of actual tennis content has become quite tough. I think players aren't that willing to give too much away. They're very aware of who's listening, what they might potentially open themselves up to. So, and I think that's because tennis is one-on-one, as I say, because another player, if you give a little bit of information another player can pick up upon, then it's obviously to your detriment.
You're trying to get that information. You also, at times, when you're at the end of these matches, you're also dealing with, depending upon the match, depending upon what round it is in and the environment, that there could be a lot of emotion involved as well with these players coming off a match that could be something that they've never done before, a win where they got to a height at which they've never been before, or maybe it was a tough loss. Where do you feel perhaps a moment where you were on point with capturing that moment when you sort of had to ad lib things because maybe you didn't expect the emotion to come? It came, but you love the way you handled something like that, where you allowed that tennis player their space, were respectful, but at the same time were able to really get to the source of how they were feeling.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually, to be honest, one of the biggest challenges of commentating during the pandemic was the lack of crowds.
Yeah.
Because there was the option to lay out and let the crowd bring the atmosphere just wasn't there. So it was actually very difficult commentating or announcing during the last 18 months up until pretty much this summer, because the reaction off a great shot just wasn't there. There was nothing. And when you don't bring anything, it feels like it's so flat. And partly because it is flat, but the tennis isn't necessarily flat, but it's everything that goes with it. It's the ambience that obviously isn't there. So that was actually, to be honest, over the last 18 months, really, really difficult. I remember doing a tournament in Dubai this year in February or March, no crowd, good tennis, really good tennis, a lot going on. And yet you come away feeling flat yourself, because so often as a broadcaster, as you know, you're feeding off the atmosphere. Your words are in tune with the New York crowd, as they were over the last couple of weeks. There are times when I don't need a voice because the New York crowd is going nuts. There's 20,000 people in Arthur Ashe going nuts. You've got Leylah Fernandez standing there with her arms aloft. Pictures tell 1,000 words in that regard. So, for me, again, it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier on. That is the skill, I think, of it's hard, I think, as a broadcaster as well, because our jobs is to talk. That's our job. You're a commentator. What do you do? Oh, okay, you talk about tennis. And yet, actually, I think, again, kind of spiraling back to what we said earlier on, at times, certainly in the last 2 months where we've had crowds again, you realize that so much of the pictures, and Mary Carrillo, who I work with a lot during the US Open, I think is very good at this. There are times where she doesn't say anything because in New York with 20,000 fans going nuts for Leylah Fernandez at 6-all in the final set, you don't need to say a lot. You don't need to say a lot because it's not really about tactics there at that point. It's about heart, and it's about letting the atmosphere talk for itself, and then bringing in some words around that are appropriate. But you know, I think to answer your question directly, certainly being aware of, and again, you know, nowadays there's a lot more microphones on court. So certainly at Masters 1000 level, players often chatting, and you can pick a lot up from players now. So again, being aware of when that might happen, so you're not talking over it, because fans want to hear what the players are saying. That's what they want to hear. If they're talking to an umpire, they want to know what's going on. So again, it's not getting in the way of that. So that's in many ways, and again, I've learned that over the years is part of the skill, I think, of what I do.
Final question for you, and Nick Lester, so grateful to have you here. I'm Bryan Fenley. How much do you miss playing tennis at that professional level as you built yourself up in your career? More so as you get older, and more so as your career as a commentator grows?
I always say, Brian, and I feel like I got the next best thing.
Yes.
I was, I couldn't be as good as I wanted to be in terms of my level. So I got the next best thing. I got to be at the US Open and the Wimbledon and the Australian Open. For me, that was, you know, in terms of what I could do, getting the feel of being around these guys and girls at the top level of the sport. I feel very lucky to have had that opportunity. And do I miss playing? You know, I played minor league professionally. So for me, I don't come on here pretending to be anything great. You know, I still play once a week, twice a week. I still try and compete a lot. I absolutely love playing. That's never left me. And I still miss the buzz of kind of, you know, hitting tennis balls, because that was always in my blood from a young age. But in terms of what I do and the job that I have no complaints.
No complaints. And you said lucky for the opportunity. I'm lucky to have you spend a couple moments with me, and this is an incredible opportunity for me to have you and to be able to reconnect. And certainly someone who I admire so much, and I didn't think I'd get any time because I knew how busy you were, and so I'm so grateful that we made it happen. Means so much to me, especially with your family and everything going on. Nick Lester, a total treat to have you. Follow Nick on Twitter, of course, at Nick Lester. I'm on Twitter at Bryan Fenley. Nick, I hope one of these days down the road we get to see each other again in person. Love the insights. Look up to you a lot. Thanks again for everything you do for the sport, and certainly for the time here and the discussion.
Pleasure. Absolute pleasure, Brian.
Nick, that was great.